Tonight we begin with a development that American defense officials had urgently mobilized for, that British intelligence had been tracking hour by hour, and that NATO commanders had activated emergency protocols to address. A coordinated rush of Western support that unfolded not over weeks of diplomatic planning, but in a single explosive 48-hour period. 48 hours that saw American military transport aircraft crossing the Atlantic at unprecedented frequency. 48 hours that witnessed British defense officials arriving in Kiev under conditions of extreme secrecy. 48 hours that triggered Vladimir Putin to issue what the Kremlin is now calling an emergency threat to the Western alliance. What Washington and London did this week crossed a threshold that Putin had explicitly warned against. And when that threshold was crossed, Moscow did not stay silent. They responded with fury, with threats, and with what intelligence officials are describing as the most dangerous escalation in rhetoric since the invasion began. For several weeks now, there had been movement, not official announcements, not press conferences, just movement, that suggested Washington and London were preparing something far more significant than routine military assistance. The Western alliance has been supportive, yes, but they have been cautious in their support. Their weapons shipments have followed a certain pattern, a schedule, almost a diplomatic choreography designed to avoid provoking Moscow's most extreme responses. But what set off alarm bells in the Kremlin this week was that the pattern accelerated dramatically. Russian intelligence services, who monitor Western military logistics, know the indicators. The increased frequency of military cargo flights, the unusual movement of diplomatic personnel, the sudden classification of normally routine communications, the unexpected visits by senior defense officials, all of that intensified simultaneously. And whenever Washington and London move together with this level of coordination, it means something significant is underway. For months, Ukraine has been requesting additional weapon systems, advanced systems that the West had been reluctant to provide due to escalation concerns. Long-range missiles capable of striking deep into Russian territory. Advanced air defense systems that could neutralize Russian aerial advantage. Next-generation drones that could transform the battlefield calculus. Western officials had consistently maintained that these systems required careful consideration, that the risks needed to be weighed against the benefits, that the timing had to be right. This week, it appears the timing became right very suddenly, and Moscow noticed immediately. Early this week, Russian intelligence services detected what they described as an unprecedented acceleration in Western military logistics, including shipments of weapon systems that had not been formally authorized for transfer in any public announcement. These are the kinds of weapons that the United States and United Kingdom only provide when they are signaling something very specific. A major shift in strategic posture, preparation for a significant Ukrainian offensive, or a decision that the risks of escalation are now outweighed by the risks of Ukrainian defeat. Kremlin observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the West was changing its approach. And when the two most powerful members of the NATO alliance shift approach without public explanation, even by the smallest degree, Moscow pays very close attention. The rush of support was remarkable in its speed and scope. American C-17 transport aircraft were tracked crossing the Atlantic in numbers not seen since the early weeks of the invasion. British military officials arrived in Kiev for meetings that were not announced until after they had concluded. Encrypted communications between Washington, London, and Kiev increased by what one source described as an order of magnitude. Something was happening. Something big. And Putin, watching from Moscow, decided he could not let it proceed without response. Within hours of confirming the accelerated Western support, the Kremlin began preparing what officials are now calling an emergency threat, a statement so severe that it required the personal involvement of Putin himself. The emergency threat issued by Putin tonight was not normal. It was not routine diplomatic protest. It was not symbolic condemnation. It was an explicit warning of catastrophic consequences. Russian officials speaking after emergency Kremlin meetings described the Western rush to Ukraine as a direct threat to Russian national security, an act of hostile intervention in the conflict, and perhaps most ominously, a provocation that could trigger responses of a nature the West has not yet experienced. But threats only work if the target backs down. Washington and London did not. In fact, their response today was among the most defiant we've seen since the invasion began. Here's what we know. Within hours of Putin's emergency threat being broadcast, American and British officials issued a coordinated statement announcing that support for Ukraine would not only continue, it would intensify. These weren't the cautious diplomatic hedges we've heard before. These were unequivocal commitments, statements that Western officials only make when they have decided that the risks of backing down exceed the risks of standing firm. The message from Washington and London was unmistakable: Putin's threats will not determine Western policy. Defense Secretary statements from both capitals made clear that the rush of support was deliberate, that it was coordinated, and that it would continue regardless of Russian objections. "We will not be deterred by threats," one senior American official said. "We will not be intimidated by ultimatums. We will support Ukraine for as long as it takes." Tonight, multiple defense sources confirmed that the rush of Western support includes weapon systems that Ukraine has been requesting for months, including advanced missile systems that had previously been withheld due to concerns about Russian escalation. Washington and London acted before Moscow could preemptively respond. They shipped ATACMS missiles capable of striking deep behind Russian lines. They delivered advanced Storm Shadow cruise missiles in quantities not previously acknowledged. They provided next-generation air defense systems that can intercept Russia's most advanced missiles. In other words, the West provided the weapons that Ukraine needs to take the initiative on the battlefield. The capabilities that could transform the strategic calculus of the entire conflict. This is what made Putin's emergency threat so explosive. The Western rush wasn't just symbolic, it was operationally significant. It represented the kind of support that could genuinely threaten Russia's military position in occupied territories. And Putin, understanding that reality completely, responded with his most severe warning yet. Not measured diplomatic language, not carefully calibrated objections, but explicit threats of catastrophic retaliation. Russian state media amplified the message throughout the day, with commentators explicitly discussing scenarios that had previously been considered too extreme for broadcast. Nuclear options were mentioned. Attacks on Western supply lines were discussed. Strikes on NATO territory were not ruled out. The rhetoric was designed to terrify. But Washington and London, instead of backing down, doubled down. They didn't reduce the weapons shipments. They didn't slow the pace of support. They accelerated it. They made clear that Putin's threats would achieve the opposite of their intended effect. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Western intelligence officials now believe that Putin's emergency threat was specifically designed to test whether extreme rhetoric could halt the acceleration of Western support. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would hesitate, whether London would reconsider, whether the threat of catastrophic escalation would create political pressure to slow the weapons shipments. But instead, the opposite happened. The United States and United Kingdom didn't hesitate. They responded with a coordinated acceleration of support that was so rapid, so comprehensive, that even Kremlin analysts expressed surprise. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, the Western alliance did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under condition of anonymity described Putin's emergency threat as coercive escalation, an attempt to use fear to achieve what Russian military forces have failed to achieve on the battlefield. But Washington and London proved today that they will not be coerced. Their support was not only continuing, it was intensifying so dramatically that Ukraine's military capabilities are about to transform significantly. That transformation matters because it shows something crucial about the state of the alliance. It shows that the United States and United Kingdom have made a strategic decision. It shows that they are no longer trying to manage the conflict cautiously. They are trying to help Ukraine win it. And that shift represents the most significant change in Western policy since the invasion began. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the extraordinary scale of the Western rush to Ukraine. American military transport aircraft carried out over 40 delivery flights in a 72-hour period, forcing logistics personnel to work around the clock. British defence officials authorised the transfer of weapons systems that had been held in reserve for months pending political approval. NATO coordination centres operating across Eastern Europe reportedly processed more weapons transfers in 48 hours than in the previous month combined. Allied nations including Poland, Germany and the Netherlands accelerated their own support programs to match the American and British pace. This wasn't just routine military assistance. This wasn't just incremental support. This was strategic reinforcement on a scale not seen since the invasion's opening weeks. This was a statement of intent visible from space. And strategic intent is the one thing Putin has struggled to deter since he launched this catastrophic war. For every threat he has issued, the West has responded with increased support. For every escalation in rhetoric, the alliance has countered with escalation in capability. For every attempt at coercion, Washington and London have delivered more weapons. The pattern is unmistakable, and it is a pattern that Putin has been unable to break. Remember, Putin thought the West would eventually tire of supporting Ukraine. He thought domestic political pressures would force Washington to reduce its commitment. He thought European energy concerns would split the alliance. He thought time was on his side. But tonight the exact opposite is happening. American support is accelerating, not declining. British commitment is intensifying, not wavering. NATO unity is stronger than at any point since the Cold War. And Putin's threats are achieving the opposite of their intended effect. This is not what the Kremlin planned. This is not what Russian strategic doctrine anticipated. This is not the outcome Putin was promised when he launched this invasion. 3 years in, the West is not exhausted. 3 years in, Ukraine is not defeated. 3 years in, the alliance is not fractured. And based on the intelligence we're seeing tonight, Moscow genuinely does not know how to reverse these realities. What makes this moment so critical and so revealing is that Putin's emergency threat happened at a time when he is under extraordinary pressure from every direction. Russian military commanders want more resources for the front lines. Russian oligarchs want the sanctions regime to end before their empires collapse entirely. Russian nationalists want escalation and total mobilization. Russian families want the war to end before more of their sons die in Ukrainian trenches. Putin is attempting to balance these competing demands while fighting a war that has gone catastrophically wrong by every measure. And when leaders in that position issue emergency threats, they're not operating from strength. They're operating from desperation. They're operating from isolation. They're operating from a position where conventional options have failed and only rhetoric remains. Tonight's emergency threat should be understood in that context. This is not a confident leader dictating terms from a position of dominance. This is a cornered leader reaching for the most extreme language in his arsenal because nothing else has worked. And that makes his threats both more desperate and, paradoxically, more dangerous. More desperate because they reveal weakness. More dangerous because desperate leaders sometimes act on threats they would otherwise know to be catastrophic. The coordinated statement from Washington and London, now circulating through every diplomatic channel in the world, was specifically designed to signal that the Western alliance will not be intimidated by emergency threats. Officials said explicitly that the rush of support to Ukraine was consistent with our long-standing commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. That is diplomatic language for, we are doing exactly what we said we would do, and Russian threats will not change that. You don't usually hear that level of directness from the White House and Downing Street simultaneously, unless something genuinely historic is happening. The joint statement went further. It announced additional weapons packages that had not been previously disclosed. It pledged continued support for as long as Ukraine requires it. It explicitly rejected the notion that Russian threats would influence Western decision-making. And it warned Moscow that any attempt to follow through on threats against NATO territory would trigger responses of overwhelming magnitude. Behind closed doors, we're told that emergency consultations are ongoing between American and British military commanders. The goal is clear: ensure that Russia understands the consequences of any attempt to interfere with Western support operations. Putin wanted to use threats to slow the weapons flow. Instead, he may have accelerated it. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation and the world in a grateful, determined speech tonight. He said, "Today, Ukraine's allies have shown what partnership truly means. They have shown that they stand with us not in words but in action." He said, "Russia issues threats. The West responds with weapons. That is the only language Moscow understands." And he said, "We are grateful beyond words, but we know that gratitude must be earned on the battlefield, and we will earn it." These are not diplomatic pleasantries. These are statements from a wartime leader who has spent 3 years fighting for his nation's survival, who has watched his cities bombed and his people murdered, and who understands exactly what this moment of Western solidarity means. When Zelensky speaks of gratitude, he speaks knowing the cost of the fight ahead. When he promises to earn the support, he speaks knowing that Ukrainian soldiers will pay that price in blood. Tonight, that promise will be backed by the most significant weapons reinforcement Ukraine has received in months. Here's what makes the situation even more volatile. Putin's emergency threat wasn't delivered in isolation. Along with his explicit warnings to Washington and London, Russian strategic forces conducted unannounced exercises with nuclear-capable systems. Russian cyber units launched coordinated attacks against Western government networks. Russian state media initiated a propaganda campaign warning of imminent catastrophe. Russian diplomatic personnel were recalled from several NATO capitals for urgent consultations. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window as the Western rush to Ukraine. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means a coordinated response is underway. Intelligence officials are now working to determine whether these moves represent genuine preparation for action or elaborate psychological theater designed to intimidate. But in the world of nuclear-armed confrontation, the distinction matters less than it might seem. Theater can become reality without warning. Exercises can transform into operations, and the margin for miscalculation is razor-thin. This is what makes the current moment so precarious. Not because war between Russia and NATO is inevitable, but because the conditions Putin is creating make accidents and misunderstandings far more likely. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Putin will accept that his threats have failed and recalibrate his approach to the conflict. Another is that Putin will attempt to interfere with Western weapons shipments through sabotage, cyber attacks, or other hybrid operations. A third possibility, the one generating the most concern in Western capitals, is that Putin will feel compelled to demonstrate that his threats are credible through some form of escalatory action. But today, Washington and London took that calculation and complicated it dramatically. They didn't hesitate when Putin issued his emergency threat. They didn't reduce their support to Ukraine. They didn't seek diplomatic off-ramps that might satisfy Russian demands. They accelerated. And in doing so, they demonstrated that the era of cautious, incremental support may be ending. What comes next is a new phase of the conflict, one where Ukraine has the weapons it needs, and the West has made clear it will provide more regardless of Russian objections. What we're watching now is a test of credibility, unlike any we've seen in this conflict. Putin wants to see whether extreme threats can accomplish what his military has failed to achieve. Washington wants to demonstrate that threats will never determine American foreign policy. London wants to prove that the special relationship remains the foundation of global security. And Ukraine wants to show the world that Western support is being translated into battlefield success. These objectives are not always perfectly compatible. The tensions between supporting Ukraine and managing escalation risks are real and ongoing. But tonight, those objectives appear aligned in ways that Putin clearly did not anticipate. The West has made its choice, and that choice is to stand with Ukraine regardless of Russian threats. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are monitoring Russian command networks for signs of how Moscow will respond to the Western rush of support. They say there is visible confusion in Kremlin communications about next steps. They say Putin's military advisors were not expecting such rapid and comprehensive Western action. And they say the emergency threat was almost certainly designed to create a pause in Western decision-making that never materialized. But Washington and London are not pausing. In fact, they are pressing their advantage. Their coordinated response today, immediate, overwhelming, and publicly defiant, sent a message to Moscow that threats will be answered with increased support for Ukraine. And it sent a message to Kiev that the West is committed for the long haul. More importantly, it sent a message to the Russian people. A message that says, "Your leaders promised a quick victory. What they have delivered is endless war against an enemy that grows stronger every month, and no amount of threatening will change that reality." That message may prove to be the most consequential of all. Because ultimately, this war will end not when Putin achieves his objectives, but when the Russian people demand an end to the catastrophe he has created.